G'day,
Great.
folks. Welcome back to the Wednesday webcast, wherever you're watching us from, whether it's live or via the recording. It's great to be with you again. I've got a really special guest today that I'm absolutely stoked to be spending some time with. Claire Vanderplank and I met through a mutual friend a little while ago. We've spent a bit of time in the bush talking together, a bit of time on Zoom calls, and this is really just an extension of that. Claire's done a lot of work over the years in both doing deep solo time in wilderness spaces up to 28 days long and also facilitating that experience for others. And we thought it'd be really interesting to have a conversation about solo time, being alone versus being lonely, and what are some of the benefits and advantages of creating that kind of space for yourself. We've got different takes on it because I've done quite a bit of that in the survival space as well. And it'll be really interesting to see what sort of a conversation we get out of that. So thanks for joining us, Claire. Appreciate you being here and your time.
Great. Thanks for having me. It's my computer's now telling my internet connection is unstable, so I have no idea why that is. I'm sitting pretty much right next to the modem.
We're
so
getting.
If I freeze,
that's why. Good stuff. So I guess I'm interested to start with, Claire. What attracted you to solo experiences? You've done things up to 28 days, which is fairly out there. What kind of got you started on that path?
I got hit by a truck.
Literally?
Yeah.
Okay.
It wasn't exactly a choice. I was riding my bike in New Zealand because I like cycle touring, and I was hit from behind, got clipped by the truck's side mirror, managed to take it off with my head. It's actually, quite a long story, but long story short, obviously that did have some flow-on effects the months afterwards, even though I really did escape quite luckily in terms of I didn't have any broken bones, but quite naively I thought, well, nothing's broken, I'll be fine. But months later, I found myself in probably the darkest place I've probably ever been. Because normally I'm just I can figure everything out for myself. I've always put myself in testing situations. But for some reason, this just wasn't shifting. I just wait long enough and the mood changes and it's fine. Wasn't the case this time. Knew I needed something completely different. And basically things aligned and I saw the invitation to what we call a sacred passage. So sacred passage is sort of like a week-long version of the quest. So normal quests are 4 days, the sacred passage was 7 days. I had no idea what was written on that invitation to go on that first week of solitude. But as soon as I looked at it, I knew that I had to do it. And I jumped on board and signed up. So it wasn't like I planned it, thought about it. It was very much sort of, I was thrust into it, had no idea that I was then going to go and run these experiences for others. Certainly wasn't in my mind. And even, in the probably at least for another year afterwards, it wasn't something that I was seriously contemplating. But yeah, once again, things had sort of aligned around me to make it so that I was just had to go and do the guide training. So yeah, it wasn't, certainly wasn't so much of a thought out thing, but it definitely makes me trust that, this is exactly what I should be doing. So that gives me, a lot of confidence with it. But obviously I believe in the value now that I've reflected on it and seen what it does offer both me and then other people.
Yeah, indeed. So that first experience was 5 days, yeah?
As a week.
7 days.
Yeah.
What were you... This is a really interesting dynamic that I've experienced going into survival courses, and I've seen lots of participants experience. When you're fronting up for that, so before the start line, you're preparing yourself physically and mentally and
something like that.
And you're kind of getting ready to go, and there's all sorts of anticipation, and you're playing movies in your head about what it might be like, and usually people have a sort of fairly dominant concern or list of concerns that they're carrying going in. What was the thing that concerned you most as you were preparing for that?
The thing that I was most hung up on was the fasting element of it. I mean, I'm a fairly like introverted creature anyway, so being alone with my own thoughts I didn't consider that to be a problem, but it was definitely the not eating thing. I've always been a very active person, and I'm pretty sure partly because that goes hand in hand with being able to eat more. So then going into an experience where I had to fast for a week, I was pretty hung up on that part of it. But of course, you go into it and that becomes the least of your worries.
Yeah, it's interesting how that changes, isn't it? Because when I went into my 10-day survival exercise as a participant before I started instructing, it was exactly the same thing. For me at that point, I was training really hard physically. I was quite competitive in triathlon, and probably riding between 400 and 600 k's a week on the bike, and doing a heap of swimming and running, and eating massive meals about 6 times a day. And that was the big thing in my head. It's like, we've got to find all our own food and water. Chances are it's going to be a lot less than what I normally eat. How will I go? And exactly like you're saying, it just turned into a non-issue when I actually got there. It wasn't a thing to be concerned about at all. So what became the biggest challenge?
What I really learnt was really about, the things that we don't give ourselves time to process in normal life. It varies, it always takes at least a couple of days for people to really start to drop into a deeper state of rest. And once your system's slowed down enough, then that is part of the space that enables things to like start to bubble up and come to the surface. So that was definitely, provided the most challenging parts was really this, it was either like fear, which was almost quite irrational. Like I've, camped and everything by myself before. It wasn't like it was really a fear of doing that part of it. Just frustrations of life. Like my dominant emotion, if I'm out of balance, is anger. So for me, it wasn't so much sort of, the grief or sadness kind of feelings. It was more sort of like just getting, pissed off about things. But of course there's no one around. So you kind of go, well, you just realize how much of it is actually on the inside. And it just leads to, well, actually, okay. So the other thing, like, is what they'll say in certain traditions is that, you have your attachments. So, the things that you overly desire, your aversions, so the things that you fear or hate. But there's also ignorance. And that's sort of like about ego blockages. So the other part to those things that were coming up were also just the ego struggling with losing control in a way. So a lot of the tension and torment that arises during these times is because as you start to kind of move into a deeper state of connection, both with inner nature, outer nature, and true nature, that's what we call it, is that, the ego starts to freak out because it's like, what? I don't get to run the ship anymore. And it's really clever. So like the tactics that it uses to make sure that it still has a grip on you, that can be a huge part of it. So it's a lot of that, like, well, what are you doing this for? Like, you're not good enough to do this, or all these strategies that you realize, oh my God, like this is what it does in everyday life all the time to maintain control. That was actually probably the harder stuff because we're so, obviously intimately identified with our ego most of the time until we get the opportunity to sort of step aside from it for a little while.
Yeah, wow, that's that's pretty specky stuff. There's some interesting territory in here about that I think relates really strongly to COVID and to the roller coaster that is for many people. And I've certainly put my hand up for that experience. There's been days where it's like, whatever, and other days where it's, gee whiz, in emotional turmoil, feeling challenged on all sorts of fronts. How much do you think that emotional experience is a collective thing? So you said before something in there about experiencing emotions in a different kind of a way because you're on your own and you're realizing that this is actually just stuff that's internal to me. Whereas I know for me that when I'm the worst at emotion, it's because I'm projecting it onto somebody or something else. And it's like, you made me angry. And it's like, no, you're just angry, dude. How much do we walk that line, do you think, between genuinely experiencing things as they are internally or externalizing them onto circumstances or people?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my whole right from that first experience, I mean, it really did change like everything about life for me, but including just how I've been able to take responsibility for my experience of it, because in that realizing that I am not my thoughts, I'm not my emotion, which I mean is very common spiritual teachings from lots of lineages, but the real value for me comes from that like actual embodied experience of it. Like my teacher really, and how we approach running the quest is not so much like we tell people the whole like philosophical framework and what to believe. It's really setting people up for the experience.
Yeah.
And in having that real then visceral embodied experience of watching these things start to come up, and the operative word being watching, because as soon as we start to be able to get that separation where I can feel like I'm observing what's going on and like I am here and this other experience, the thought or the emotion is over there, that's the beauty of the power of the witness effect, is that then we're not identified with it. And so that's really given me, like, to me, it's not just a catchphrase to say I'm responsible for my experience. It's like, no, I really am. Like if I'm having a reaction in a certain situation, that's not anyone else's fault. I mean, and it's not my fault either. Like you also learn to have a lot more sympathy for yourself, because you're like, oh my God, just the experience of being human. Look at all these things that, happen to us and we experience. But yeah, and because of then also, responsibility, like once I realize that I have the ability to respond to emotional situations in a different way, because I realize that it doesn't need to have the power over me, then it shifts your orientation towards those kinds of experiences to armoring up and coping and projecting it and saying, well, that's your fault, I feel this way, to really being like, taking ownership of your own experience, which is just completely invaluable.
Yeah. I reckon there's a nice little dance in there somewhere about taking that ownership and responsibility, but doing it in a really light way. You've mentioned being kind to yourself. I love what Bob Sharples, an Australian meditation teacher, says about that. He talks about, doing meditation as an act of deep self-love so that you can let go of the subtle aggression of self-improvement. And I love that frame. It's like it's so tempting in our current context to look at self-improvement as I'm not good enough, I've got to flog myself to be better and improve and overcome my weaknesses and fill my blind spots and reduce my gaps and increase my capability. And it's very driven, as opposed to, for me, I think the most helpful mindset I can find around this stuff is to be able to approach yourself almost as you would a child. You've got that kind of cheeky grin on that says, "Oh, isn't that cute?" And come on, mate, walk this way. I'll give you a hand with that sort of thing, rather than.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like that, the difference between self-improvement and self-love, you come to realize that if you're trying to improve yourself, it's still that mindset of control. So, and that can only come from a worldview where everything's separate and atomized, because that's how change happens in that worldview. Because things aren't fundamentally connected, if we want to create a change on this other thing that is ultimately separate from us, then we need to apply a force to it. And I mean, obviously there's lots of implications for the world around us and how society is approaching nature and every other aspect of life. But it definitely applies to ourselves, where we think the only way for us to change is if we force ourselves to. Whereas as we move deeper into connection, realize that, you know, connectedness is actually the fundamental reality. That whole mindset of how does change happen, we no longer need to force ourselves to do things, because once we allow, you know, who we truly are to come through, then there's nothing to be coerced or forced about it.
So I'd love to ask you a bit about creating the space for the kinds of experiences that you've led or facilitated, because it's very different from the survival stuff that I've done. So, you know, my intent as a survival instructor is to make life as hard as I possibly can for you. It's all about turning duress and uncertainty up, and actually creating a space that's intentionally quite difficult to be in, and to provoke reactiveness and particularly fight or flight and all of those things that happen when we're hit by a moment of impact, specifically to test how quickly can you kind of get yourself under control and start to make effective decisions and, you know, get logical and all that sort of stuff. And the sort of space you're talking about is quite a different space to that. A much more sort of, you know, welcome, come in, warm kind of space, I would imagine. So, how do you create and hold the space for people who want to do deep solo work?
Well, I think it's definitely worth noting that the element of challenge really does have to be there. You know, in any kind of initiation or rites of passage, it involves a brush with death, and that's either sounds dramatic. More often that's perceived as opposed to real, but basically people wouldn't sign up if they didn't feel like it was going to push them to their edges. So there already is that element, and because a big part of it is this ego death. And so some people have come into it talking about dreams of, like, basically that involve dying, and they're like, but I don't understand. I mean, I don't believe that it's physically difficult, but like, yeah, your ego probably thinks it's a little bit can sense the potential for death in that regard. However, once people then come into it, you know, really, you know, my job, or how I see my job fundamentally, is about helping them feel comfortable and curious enough about it that they're really willing to surrender themselves to the experience. It's very difficult to get through the time if we're like, okay, well, I'm going to like try to control every aspect of it such to maneuver it to my advantage. Because there aren't part of the reason why it's so effective is because there aren't too many working variables. You go and you sit in one spot, you can't move, like in terms of like, you don't get to walk around. You're fasting, so that takes out a lot of distraction, like just how much of our lives is to do with, like, you know, buying food, preparing food, eating food, sharing meals. There's a lot of our life that has to do with food. So that part of it is taken out of it. You've got no distractions. You can't bring a book or anything else. So there's not too much for people to really, you know, be able to feel like they can control anyway. Like, what's going to happen is just what's going to happen. But if we can really get ourselves into a space of like, I know that this is beyond what I can control, and therefore I'm going to just surrender to it, that's really when the magic starts, because that's when we start even being able to let go of mental constructs about what reality actually is. Or, you know, okay, well, I never thought I'd be able to actually have an experience of a meaningful, you know, exchange with an animal or a tree, or, you know, so being able to just release and go, well, you know, you don't have to believe any of this. It's really just creating that playfulness. So I share, you know, stories from my own experience, because it wasn't like I went in thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to go and talk to this bird and it's going to tell me la la la. You know, things happen in that first experience for me that just completely shattered, you know, my view of the world forever. And you know, has happened for a lot of other people too. So through sharing stories is how we can kind of, you know, learn about what's possible and get ourselves into that sort of, space of excitement and just openness and playfulness. So it's and it's a ceremonial space as well. So it is about how do you hold this moment as truly sacred, and that sort of gives it its you know, transformational capacity as well. So yeah, it's simple, but there's layers.
Yeah. Yeah, which, you know, there's some strong parallels there with the survival territory as well. You know, again, a fairly simple experience, but for a lot of people, you know, we were talking about food before. That's something that's on people's mind going in very often. But more often than not, the experience that they have living out of a soapbox-sized survival kit for 10 days and finding they're not even using all of what's in there. And, you know, I recall this really deeply from the first time I did it as a participant. You get to about day 5 or 6 of 10 and you go, well, I haven't even used a third of what's in this tiny little box, and I'm surrounded by all this stuff when I'm at home. What's the meaning of it all, you know? And it's almost like this process of unpacking and examining the things that you have in your life, and both physical things and also relationships and people and things that occupy your mind, and consciously choosing, you know, do I want that or do I not want that? And why? And that's quite powerful. That can be quite transformational too. And it's outside of the construction of the actual space and the exercise. You know, it's not that survival exercise definitely isn't put together as a personal transformation journey, but quite often that is people's experience of it, which is really fascinating. I think
definitely. And certainly a lot of things change for people in their normal lives after doing a quest, you know, and in quite, you know, tangible, concrete ways as well. It's not just sort of the worldview thing. It's also like, what do I just be really clear on what's serving me and what's not. And, you know, sometimes things fall, people quit their jobs. I mean, I quit my job after that first Sacred Passage. Wasn't planning to in such a short space of time. Relationships fall away from people, and I mean, I think it's a lot to do with that, just coming back to, you know, well, who really am I? What do I really value? And being able to just, you know, then also witness. So that stuff that comes up is about to do with the things that we haven't allowed ourselves, you know, to see in its truth about what is really doing for us. So there's a lot of reasons why the change happens, but it definitely does happen.
For sure. So I'm interested in, you know, given the frame for starting these conversations was COVID, and particularly early on we were talking about you know, decision making and crisis management and all those kinds of bits of territory. And as time's gone on, we've moved more into either sustaining yourself through the long haul of how the disease is rolling out. You know, people like Doug and June, their countries are still deep in numbers of cases expanding, and numbers of people perishing are fairly high, and you know, a long way from getting any sort of semblance of control. We're in a part of the world here where, you know, we've partly due to our isolation and partly due to astute management, we're sort of reasonably COVID free, but certainly not immune. But part of what the progression of the pandemic has done is, many people have been forced into isolation, and for some that is solo, and for others it's a collective experience with family. What kind of advice would you give to people about dealing with that space and using it well? We were talking before about control, so we're obviously in an environment where we don't individually have any control over that, and collectively we've got marginal control over it. So we're forced into that space to a greater or lesser degree. How can you use it? How could you create the kind of space you're talking about for yourself or your family, and use the time in a way that was generative and effective, rather than looking at in that control kind of space? When will it end? Slapping arbitrary dates on when we can travel next and all of that sort of territory.
Yeah. Or there's a lot of ways we could I could take it from there. I mean, in terms of the immediate, like, day-to-day approach, well, for a start, I think it's useful to recognize this as a kind of collective initiation or rite of passage. Sometimes people go into rites of passage consciously in terms of, like, now would be a great time for me to step into the next stage of my life. Other times it gets forced upon us. So, and that's can be the most difficult, and that's sort of where we're at, collectively. Like, I really think that this is a time of humanity kind of being called to move from its adolescence into its maturity as an adult. Like, there's so many myths that tell us about how, humans are, well, in the Noongar understanding, which is where the land that we're both from or living now, is that humans are the carers of everything. And that theme pops up in very deeply connected cultures all around the world. So, I do want to bring that in, because the thing about, like, a rite of passage is that what we really realize is that it's not about us. Like, traditionally, that moving into adulthood and using the vision quest to receive a vision about what is my purpose in my community and for the rest of life. So we got to realize that it's not about, if we truly want to treat this as a rite of passage, that it's not about, like, what am I going to get from it? It's really about, how do I learn to be of greater service, and how can I show up and be more of a responsible adult or a carer for everything. So just want to put that out there to begin with. And it's really worth acknowledging that, because if we don't sort of, come to realize the full gravity of the situation that we're in, then we can't really bring the right intention to how we treat it. So it's worth contemplating that. On a day-to-day basis, like, I even notice for, myself now, like, just the value of having a daily time for cultivation has been really essential. So, these are things that, obviously, having done the long quests, it's giving me a really strong anchor into, okay, well, if I feel like my world's getting too turbulent, I always know that there's that sort of still, calm place to come back to. So what I sort of say to people is, try to bring to mind, even if you're not a regular meditator, everyone has experiences of moments of being in, a deeper, calmer, more positive state of being. So we really want to try to find that kind of anchor for us, and find, like, what can we use to help trigger it. And so it can be as simple as, where do you feel the most calm and relaxed? For me, it's like, I'll go to the beach if I want to, really do a meditation that helps me kind of be able to release anxiety. I really recommend doing eyes open meditation, and really focusing on an open gaze, because that can change what's happening neurologically and change our brainwave states really quickly and really effectively. So just do even 3 to 5 minutes of an open, soft gaze meditation helps shift our state of being. And it helps like lift us out of like, oh my God, like, you know, like when we're anxious, we're also like self-centered and we can't just see the bigger picture of what's really going on. So it's almost like breaking that pattern and going to, oh, okay, like there is room to breathe, there is space. Obviously, whatever various states of lockdown might restrict exactly where you can go in that time, but you know, it's just trying to find like what's the best that you can do, like in the space that you've got available.
I'll just pause you there and make an observation and ask a question. So the observation is, that sounds like a great tactic. You know, we know about fight or flight, that the more stressed we are, the more we feel that we're in that state, the more we feel threatened, the narrower our perception becomes. And you know, you often talk to people after an event and they go, oh, my whole focus was on this element here that was right in front of me and I couldn't see anything else. And once I got past it, it turned out that wasn't even a thing. The main game was being played over here somewhere and I was missing it because I was, you know, had my nose right down in this wheel rut. So tell us a bit more about what you mean by eyes open's pretty obvious, but open gaze.
Open gaze. Yeah. So basically, like, usually how we get kind of trained to experience the world and sense the world is very much through, I look at one thing and that's what I'm focused on. And unfortunately now more often it's like I look at one thing and then another because my attention is constantly being fractured. So that's using what we call closed awareness. If you move into open awareness, it's when you're sitting back and not focusing on any one thing in particular. So to use the beach example, so if I had my eyes open facing the ocean, I would then try to check that I was really doing it. I would then check to see, am I aware of the patterns of the waves coming in my peripheral vision? So, you know, one little technique to help get yourself to do it is you can, like, you know, bring your thumbs in front of you and then move them to the side. And like right now I'm still watching my thumbs, you know, even as I'm looking at the screen because I'm using my peripheral vision. So it's learning the flexibility of awareness, which is a really good training skill in general. So you can do that. Yeah, your eyes open is probably the most like the best practice in order to break that pattern, because we're so vision dominant that learning how to break just looking at one particular thing and observing the whole is a really, really good training skill. And that has, like I said, immediate effects on how our brain's functioning, but obviously the implications of stepping back from looking at things in an atomized way to seeing the whole picture. You know, it's not hard to draw the parallels to what that means for looking at sort of complex situations, which I would say, like, you know, I've observed in myself from since, you know, starting this kind of practice, 8 years ago now, that I've changed a lot to being someone who was always like the clever one, the critical one, the intelligent one, like, you know, report cards at school, whatever it all say, that kind of thing, to suddenly being like the creative, innovative systems thinker. I mean, probably always had a bent to systems thinking, but nonetheless, it's like my capacity to do those things has just, you know, gone through the roof. And I really think it's because I've learned to shift the way that I'm perceiving the world. And that really starts with like your actual senses. Like our senses are the actual way that we experience life. So it's not a minute, unimportant thing to start practicing to learn your senses, to learn to work with your senses in different ways. Yeah.
So is the actual practice of a meditation like that? So, you know, if I'm doing eyes closed meditation, say focused on breath, then I'm I'm trying to notice those moments where I disconnect from my breathing and my mind starts wandering and getting into other things, and actually come back to, whatever I'm focused on, the feel of it coming in and out of my nostrils, for example. Is it the same kind of thing? So I'm noticing that I'm getting fixated on a bit of detail, like that wave or that bird or that ship on the horizon, and I just trying to soften the gaze back out to all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. It's actually doing it with sound is also really effective in that way. Like it's almost less distracting to do it with sound. So if you close your eyes and then noticing what your ears are picking up on, I think because we're so easily distracted by visual input, we can sort of get lost in it. But if you want to take it back to the easiest way to do it, doing it just with your auditory sense. And so you can use little prompts to yourself, like, what's the furthest away thing I can hear, and what's the closest, and am I listening to the front and the back and the sides? So I just use little cues to myself to sort of get me in that state. And then once I notice if I've started to label things like, oh, that's a willy wagtail and there's that train, then I go, oh, I'm out of it, because really the practice is just letting the sensory information kind of wash over you. And where it gets really relevant, I think, going back to how it applies to the COVID situation, you do that practice long enough and you start to experience this sensory input as sort of like, almost like watching a movie theater screen. So there's the screen and there's all these things playing across it, and how we can begin to experience life or this sensory input, which is what makes up our experience of life, is sort of like the screen is our consciousness, and then all the lights playing across it is, this experience of the rest of life. But what that really, starts to bleed into is this being able to experience life as, being anchored and centered in this unchanging, like the screen doesn't change. And so we can experience this stability in ourselves once we identify with the screen rather than the play. And that means that even when there is lots of turbulence happening in life, we always have a solid base to come back to. And we realize that, life was always this moving, changing thing. It becomes a lot easier just to realize that even in moments like this, what really is true and what really is, the anchor to what really is us actually doesn't change. And it means, don't need to get so swept up by it all.
Yeah, that's great. Claire, thanks very much. I think there's some really useful, we've kind of covered a huge piece of territory there from personal experience and, really some really big concepts, right down to some nitty gritty about actual tactics for creating and using that sort of solo space effectively for yourself, either intentionally or making the most of it if it's unintentionally happening to you because of lockdowns and things. What sort of impact, as a closing question, what's the impact that you hope to have on the world?
Just You've only got 2 minutes, question.
Just a small one.
Look, my real, mission is about, it's about nature connection, but ultimately it's like coming to realize that we are nature and that the route to sustainability is to learn to pattern ourselves as nature itself. And how to do that as well is a whole big conversation, but really it's like we're not going to get ourselves out of this pattern of collapse if we don't learn to act as life itself. And that's about that control thing, but it's also about like really detailed design principles, like how do we build like biomimicry into our systems, because until we have systems that operate to serve life, then it's ultimately going to be self-terminating. So really I want to take that embodied experience of being able to go out and practice in nature and allow that to flow all the way through into how we're living and leading and doing our systems design work.
Awesome. That sounds great. thanks very much for joining us and for your insights and personal experience.
Thanks, Mike.
If people want to find you for more, where would they go?
My website is womc.com.au. So my business name is Weapons of Mass Creation. If you Google that, you're probably likely to find me. And of course, I'm on social media as well. So Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. Yeah, those are all good places.
Thanks very much.